Flames tore through the neighborhood. Sirens blared in the distance. Yet the HOA president stood firm, arms crossed, blocking the fire truck. What happened next would shake the entire community. Evergreen Estates was a pristine, gated neighborhood with towering oak trees, meticulously maintained lawns, and an HOA board that ruled with an iron fist. At the top sat Mark Reynolds, a man who thrived on control. To him, rules weren't just guidelines. They were sacred laws that kept the community perfect. Fines were his weapon, and power was his addiction. Most homeowners despised the HOA, but they tolerated it until that night. It started with a flicker, a single spark from a faulty wire in Sarah Whitman's home, a modest two-story house near the entrance of the neighborhood. Within minutes, the fire spread, consuming walls, furniture, and everything in its path. Smoke billowed into the sky, a beacon of distress in the otherwise quiet night. Sarah, a single mother, had just put her 5-year-old daughter to bed when she smelled the smoke. Her heart pounded as she rushed to grab her child, barely making it downstairs before flames cut off their escape. Neighbors saw the fire and sprang into action, calling 911. Within moments, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, promising salvation. A fire truck came speeding toward the community gate, red lights flashing, a team of firefighters prepared to battle the blaze. But they couldn't get in. The gate to Evergreen Estates was electronically locked, accessible only by the HOA board. The firefighters honked, flashed their lights, and radioed for access. Nothing. No response. Minutes ticked by, each second allowing the fire to grow. Then, from the clubhouse down the street, Mark Reynolds emerged, dressed in his usual crisp polo shirt, clipboard in hand, a smug expression plastered across his face. The head firefighter, a burly man with gear streaked with soot, rushed up. "Open the gate. There's a fire. People are trapped inside." Mark adjusted his glasses, feigning concern. "I understand, but this homeowner has unpaid fines. Our policy states that access can't be granted until all outstanding balances are cleared." The firefighter's jaw clenched. "Are you kidding me? There are lives at stake." Mark shrugged. "Rules are rules." Panic spread among the neighbors. Some shouted at Mark, others begged, but he refused to budge. Behind him, HOA security guards stood at the ready, prepared to enforce Mark's decree. Sarah's screams echoed from her burning home. The fire had reached the second floor. Desperate, one of the firefighters pulled out a fire axe, ready to break through the gate. But Mark stepped in front of him. "If you damage HOA property, I will have you arrested for destruction of private property," he sneered. More sirens approached. Police backup had arrived. But instead of forcing the gate open, Officer Todd Michaels, a close friend of Mark, exited his patrol car and strolled over. "I believe the HOA has the legal right to enforce its community rules," Todd said with a smirk. The crowd erupted in disbelief. Firefighters fumed. The clock was ticking. Then, a loud roar filled the air. James Carter, a former firefighter and homeowner, gunned his pickup truck straight into the gate, shattering it into twisted metal. Without hesitation, the fire truck surged forward, its crew racing toward the inferno. Mark screamed in outrage, threatening lawsuits, fines, and arrests, but no one listened anymore. The battle for control was over. The battle for survival had begun. Thick black smoke coiled into the night sky as firefighters rushed past the wreckage of the gate, their boots pounding against the pavement. Flames had already consumed half of Sarah Whitman's home, the fire licking at neighboring houses like a hungry beast. James Carter, the man who had obliterated the gate with his truck, stepped out, chest heaving with adrenaline. He wasn't a rule breaker. He was a man who had spent years saving lives as a firefighter before retiring. Watching a fire crew being stopped over petty HOA rules had flipped a switch inside him. Mark Reynolds, still in shock from the destruction of the gate, turned to his security guards. "Arrest him. That's destruction of property." James didn't flinch. He met Mark's furious gaze and growled, "You nearly killed a woman and her child because of a damn fine." Before Mark could respond, a piercing scream came from the house. The firefighters had reached Sarah and her daughter, pulling them from the burning wreckage. Sarah collapsed on the grass, coughing violently as paramedics swarmed in. Her daughter clung to her, sobbing in fear. The crowd erupted in cheers, neighbors hugging, relief washing over them. But the battle wasn't over. Mark turned to his closest ally, Officer Todd Michaels, expecting backup. You saw that? They destroyed HOA property. I want them arrested. Todd nodded, pulling out his radio. All units, we have a case of negligence leading to loss of life. A new voice cut in. Todd spun around. A second police car had arrived, and out stepped Captain Robert Hayes, a veteran officer known for his no-nonsense approach to justice. He had seen the viral footage from a neighbor's live stream on his way here. Wait a minute, Mark stammered, his confidence faltering. Hayes ignored him, eyes scanning the destruction. Mark Reynolds, I need you to come with me for questioning. Mark let out a barking laugh. For what? Enforcing HOA policies? This is private property. I was protecting. Hayes held up a phone, playing back the viral video of Mark smugly blocking the fire crew while Sarah and her daughter screamed for help in the background. The entire internet was watching. The HOA president's face turned pale. Police policy states that anyone who willfully obstructs emergency services during a life-threatening event can be charged with reckless endangerment. Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His power was slipping. Before he could react, James took a step closer, voice low but cutting. You have no idea how lucky you are that I got that gate open in time. He pointed at Sarah's still-smoking house. Because if I hadn't, you wouldn't be arguing fines right now. You'd be explaining 2 deaths in court. The gathered neighbors erupted into angry shouts, some pushing forward, others recording, capturing every second of Mark's humiliation. But Mark wasn't going down without a fight. The HOA will take legal action, he snapped. Every single person here will be fined for violating HOA property. The gate will be rebuilt, and you'll all be paying for it. Silence. Then James let out a low chuckle, one that spread through the crowd like wildfire. One neighbor started laughing, then another. Soon, the entire neighborhood was roaring in amusement, shaking their heads at the sheer delusion of the man. The spell had been broken. Mark wasn't feared anymore. He was a joke. But the real consequences were still ahead. Because while Mark argued, while the neighborhood turned against him, and while Captain Hayes sized him up for cuffs, something else was happening behind the scenes. Someone had dug into the HOA's records, and what they found would shake Evergreen Estates to its core. The fire had been extinguished, but the real storm was just beginning. The neighborhood was buzzing with activity, firefighters wrapping up their work, police officers questioning witnesses, and neighbors whispering in hushed, furious tones. The once feared HOA board, particularly Mark Reynolds, stood isolated, their grip on the community crumbling. Despite everything, Mark still refused to accept responsibility. He stormed toward Captain Robert Hayes, his face twisted in rage. This is slander. I was just following protocol. If anything, they should be arrested for breaking the gate. Hayes didn't even look at him. He was focused on the dozens of phone screens held high, recording every second of Mark's meltdown. This isn't slander, Hayes said coldly. It's evidence. Mark turned toward Officer Todd Michaels, expecting him to intervene. Todd, do something. You know how this works. Community rules override. Todd stepped back, suddenly very interested in his notepad. The look on his face was clear. You're on your own. Mark's fists clenched, but then a familiar sneer slid across his face. You think you've won? This neighborhood still belongs to the HOA, and I'll be filing fines for all. A voice cut him off. One of the neighbors, a young woman named Laura, had been digging through public records while all of this unfolded. She let out a gasp and turned her phone toward the crowd. You guys, you need to see this. The screen displayed financial records from the HOA's budget. At first glance, it seemed normal. Maintenance fees, landscaping, security. But then one line item stood out. Private legal retainer. $200,000 paid to Mark Reynolds' personal lawyer. The crowd fell silent. James Carter snatched the phone and scrolled further. Luxury HOA conference trip, $75,000. Executive bonus, $50,000 paid to Mark Reynolds. James looked up, fury in his eyes. Mark, care to explain why HOA funds were being used to pay your personal legal team? Mark's confidence wavered for the first time. That's private HOA business. You don't have the right to look at. Laura cut him off. HOA finances are public record, Mark. And these expenses, they're embezzlement. The crowd exploded. You stole from us. This is where our fees have been going. I got fined for leaving my trash bin out too long, and this guy's blowing thousands on vacations. Mark's face turned an ugly shade of red. You don't understand. The HOA needs strong leadership, and sometimes that requires. Captain Hayes had heard enough. You were extorting homeowners, blocking emergency responders, and using community funds to line your own pockets. He nodded to one of his officers. Take him in. Mark's smirk vanished. Wait. No. No. This is a misunderstanding. He looked desperately at Todd Michaels, but the officer wouldn't meet his eyes. The handcuffs clicked shut around Mark's wrists, and that's when the real panic set in. Because Mark wasn't the only one involved. The HOA board members, who had stood by silently this whole time, began backing away. Some ran for their cars. Others tried to claim they had no idea what Mark was doing. But the neighbors were done being silent. They surrounded the board members, blocking them from leaving. James crossed his arms and smirked. I think the police might want to look at all of you next. Mark's screams faded as he was shoved into the police car. The neighborhood watched in eerie silence as the once powerful HOA president was driven away. For the first time in years, Evergreen Estates felt free. But there was still unfinished business. Because while Mark was facing immediate justice, there was still the matter of the HOA itself, and the neighborhood was ready for revenge. The next morning, Evergreen Estates felt different. For the first time in years, homeowners walked the streets without fear of being fined for ridiculous reasons. The dictatorship of Mark Reynolds had fallen, but there was still unfinished business, the entire HOA system that enabled his corruption. The investigation began within hours of Mark's arrest. The city had launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's operations. Captain Robert Hayes had been watching HOA corruption for years, and now, with public outrage at an all-time high, he had the leverage to act. Investigators subpoenaed HOA financial records, which revealed even more shocking details. Hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned into administrative fees, with no clear purpose. HOA board members paying themselves illegal bonuses, fake violation notices issued to justify increased HOA fees, and security contracts given to Mark's friends who charged double the normal rates. The media pounced on the scandal. News stations ran the viral footage of Mark blocking the fire truck on repeat, and online forums ripped apart the HOA's corruption. Evergreen Estates became the poster child for HOA abuse, fueling calls for stronger HOA regulations nationwide. With Mark behind bars, the rest of the HOA board panicked. They thought they could escape the fallout, but the evidence was overwhelming. Under pressure, board members began turning on each other to cut plea deals. James Whitaker, the HOA treasurer, was the first to crack. He confessed to doctoring financial reports to hide Mark's embezzlement. Linda Caldwell, head of enforcement, admitted that they rigged HOA elections to keep Mark in power. David Owens, the HOA vice president, tried to flee the state but was arrested at the airport when authorities found $50,000 in cash in his luggage, money siphoned from HOA funds. Each confession brought more charges, ensuring that none of them would walk away unscathed. Mark Reynolds, now facing years in prison, thought he had one last trick up his sleeve. From behind bars, he contacted a high-profile lawyer, hoping to get out on bail. But Mark had underestimated the neighborhood's fury. Every single homeowner filed a lawsuit against the HOA for misuse of funds, illegal enforcement, and obstruction of emergency services. A class action suit demanded every single fine be refunded, totaling over $1 million. The city council, embarrassed by the national attention, announced a new law limiting HOA powers, effectively crippling their ability to operate. Facing dozens of lawsuits and no legal escape, the HOA was officially dissolved. The night the HOA was disbanded, Evergreen Estates threw the biggest block party the neighborhood had ever seen. The old HOA office was torn down, replaced with a community park. As the sun set, James Carter stood up in front of the crowd, raising a toast to a neighborhood without fear, fines, or fraud. The cheers were deafening, and somewhere in a cold prison cell, Mark Reynolds realized he would never be in control again. Mark Reynolds sat in the county jail, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his once proud posture slumped. The mugshot cameras flashed, capturing the fall of the most hated HOA president in Evergreen Estates history. But Mark wasn't done fighting. From his cell, he called his high-profile attorney, a man known for getting criminals off on technicalities. Mark was convinced he could escape the charges. After all, he hadn't directly committed arson, right? Blocking a fire truck, that was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Or so he thought. The courtroom was packed on the day of Mark's trial. Homeowners who had suffered under his reign filled the gallery, waiting for justice. The prosecution came prepared, armed with video evidence of Mark stopping the fire truck, testimonies from the firefighters about how every second of delay could have killed Sarah and her daughter, and documents proving he embezzled HOA funds. Mark's lawyer tried to spin the narrative, claiming Mark was just following HOA protocol and had no intention of harming anyone. That argument lasted all of 5 minutes before the prosecution dropped a bombshell. A new witness took the stand. It was Officer Todd Michaels, Mark's old ally, the same police officer who had backed him at the fire scene, now sat on the witness stand with his hands folded, looking regretful. The prosecutor smirked. "Officer Michaels, would you like to share what you told us in your sworn statement?" Todd sighed, shifting in his seat. Then he exposed everything. Mark had personally called Todd before the fire truck arrived, telling him to back him up no matter what. Todd admitted that Mark bragged about making an example out of Sarah Whitman, calling her a rule breaker who needed to learn her place. And worst of all, Mark had been inside the HOA clubhouse watching the fire burn, drinking wine, and laughing. The courtroom gasped. Even Mark's lawyer looked stunned. "You're lying," Mark shouted, face red with fury. Todd simply shook his head. "You think I'm going down for you, Mark? You're insane." It didn't take long for the jury to decide. Mark Reynolds was found guilty on all charges: reckless endangerment, obstruction of emergency services, fraud, and embezzlement. The judge, looking down at Mark with thinly veiled disgust, sentenced him to 5 years in prison and ordered him to pay back every single stolen dollar. Mark's jaw dropped. 5 years. He had expected a fine, maybe community service, but actual prison time? Then came the twist. As the guards prepared to take Mark away, the judge raised a hand. "One more thing." Mark froze. The judge smiled coldly. "Since you love enforcing rules so much, I have a special arrangement. You'll be serving your sentence in a prison that has its own internal HOA." The entire courtroom burst into laughter. Mark's face drained of all color. Mark was transferred to a low-security prison where he quickly learned what it was like to live under strict, ridiculous rules. His new cell block HOA charged him 2 cigarettes a week for access to the TV room. If he wanted an extra pillow, that was a violation. If his bed wasn't made to exact standards, he got fined by the inmates. One day, he complained to the prison warden about these unfair rules. The warden smirked. "Now you know how your neighbors felt." For the first time, Mark had no power, no control, no way out. And Evergreen Estates, it thrived without him. Evergreen Estates had finally shed the chains of HOA tyranny, and the residents wasted no time making sure it stayed that way. The very next day, homeowners gathered in what used to be the HOA's main office, a sleek building that once housed board meetings where Mark Reynolds dictated absurd rules and doled out fines for petty violations. Now, it was getting demolished. Before tearing it down, the neighborhood held a special ceremony. A massive banner was draped over the front of the building, reading, "In loving memory of common sense," which the HOA never had. A giant bonfire was set up where people threw in old HOA violation notices, parking fines, lawn height warnings, even a ridiculous citation someone got for having a too bright porch light. James Carter, the man who crashed through the gate, got the honor of swinging the first sledgehammer into the old HOA office. The cheers were deafening as the building crumbled. The neighborhood celebrated true freedom. No more fines for trash bins left out too long, no more harassment over mailbox colors, and most importantly, no more Mark Reynolds. Meanwhile, in prison, Mark's new life was a nightmare. The prison HOA, a group of inmates who thrived on power trips, made sure of that. His cellmate was a former firefighter, and let's just say he wasn't happy about what Mark did. He had weekly inspections where inmates fined him in cigarettes for things like an untidy bed or not folding his socks correctly. Every time he complained to the guards, they smirked and shrugged. Mark was living under his own brand of HOA hell, and he couldn't do a thing about it. Evergreen Estates wasn't just surviving without the HOA, it was thriving. The community formed a volunteer group to handle things like landscaping and street repairs without any absurd rules or power-hungry enforcers. They set up a new emergency response plan, ensuring that no gate would ever block first responders again. And for the first time in years, people actually felt like a community. As the sun set on the now HOA-free Evergreen Estates, James Carter stood up on a makeshift stage and looked out at the cheering crowd. With a grin, he held up a charred HOA violation notice and asked, "How many of you have ever dealt with an HOA nightmare?" The crowd roared in response. Well, you know what to do. Drop your worst HOA horror stories in the comments below. And if you think HOA should be held accountable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because trust me, there's more where this came from. The screen fades to black, but not before showing one final shot of Mark Reynolds sitting in his prison cell, reading a violation notice from his new prison HOA. Justice had been served, and for Evergreen Estates, the future had never looked brighter.